Ultimate Spider-Man was released 18 years ago. Feel old yet? The early 2000s were a great time to be a Spider-Man fan. We received two excellent games from Neversoft, a solid movie tie-in game for the newly released Sam Raimi directed Spider-Man movie, and its sequel, Spider-Man 2, solidified itself as the best movie and game in the character's history for years to come. The next Spider-Man game would have a lot to live up to, and in the case of Activision's next Spider-Man title, they would already be at a disadvantage. Their new title was not tied to any mainstream film under the same name, and rather a, arguably more niche, comic book run. As we approach the release of Marvel's Spider-Man 2, there's an ever-increasing chance that we will see the greatest portrayal of Venom in a video game. So to refresh our memory, let's look back at what I believe to be the best video game portrayal of Venom in one of the better Spider-Man games, and of course, spoilers ahead. Spider-Man 2 broke the mold in many ways for the wall crawler, and Ultimate Spider-Man aims to refine the fundamental advancements made in that game, while also moving in a new direction. The result is a game that succeeds in many areas, fails in some, and most importantly, has such a sense of identity that it has become timeless. After 18 years, Ultimate Spider-Man is still one of the greatest Spider-Man games out there, with its largest flaw being just how little of it there is. This is a Spider-Man game that is mechanically dense, but prioritizes quality over quantity to a detrimental degree, which these days seems backwards to many. Personally, I would prefer a game to be short and sweet than long and boring, but this discussion means nothing because we can't buy the game. Due to Activision losing the license to their Spider-Man games, they can no longer be sold, which means getting your hands on this game is impossible. Of course, pirates are still able to access the game with ease, but I won't condone any of that, because it is morally incorrect to pirate, guys. Just think about how harshly you're affecting the bigwigs at Activision. I mean, they're likely wiping their tears with $100 bills as we speak. I know, it's their fault because they won't let us buy the game legally, but they have a lot on their plate. They have to push out an update for Warzone once every 3 months that actively makes the game worse, and they have to abuse, assault, underpay, and overwork their employees on top of that. Cut them a break. Anyways, it might be tough to buy this game, but you guys are smart, you'll figure it out. Ultimate Spider-Man takes place within the Ultimate comic universe, and while at first being a canon story likely taking place between issues 71 and 72, the plot of this game was later reworked and adapted to issues 123 to 128. So this game is in a strange limbo between canon and non-canon. Regardless, while having the backstory of the comic series will further contextualize the plot here, it is not needed to understand the simple story. Keeping with its comic book roots, this game boasts a unique visual style that looks like a playable comic, all the way from its cel-shaded art style to its cutscenes, which feature comic panels, onomatopoeias, and other visual styles that are otherwise associated with comics. This allows the game to have an identifiable visual flair that ages at a snail's pace. Something important to note about Ultimate Spider-Man is that it is building off of the precedent set in Spider-Man 2. It has enough to separate itself, but this game does not get the same slack that Spider-Man 2 got, because it is not the first to attempt an open world with physics-based swinging and organic city events. Now, in a poorly made Spider-Man game, this would be a problem, but this is no ordinary Spider-Man game, and that is visible through every single frame. The visual style of Ultimate Spider-Man is timeless. The team behind the game went to great lengths to present a playable comic book. What's further unique is that the characters here, whose designs are damn near iconic, are not bound to the frames and panels. Venom will jump from one page to the next, the camera will transition from scene to scene like eyes darting from one panel to another, and the freeze frames further sell the idea. The animations are also beautifully executed, looking impressive for a game this old, including what's seen in gameplay. New York this time around includes a bit of Queens too, and much like Spider-Man 2, comes alive at night. The city during the day fulfills a surface-level Spider-Man fantasy and isn't lacking by much. The draw distance isn't the best, and truthfully, some buildings can look rather samey, but with enough notable landmarks like the construction site, the Baxter building, the school, and the Trask building, it's easy to have an idea of where you are at any given point. It's at nighttime that the city becomes so much more immersive. Neon covers the skyline surrounding Times Square, nightclubs are full of people and lights, and the luminance from the many apartments and offices makes New York truly a city that never sleeps. There's detail to be found through every sign, graffiti art, and billboard. Is it beating the modern releases of today? No. But is it good enough to keep you immersed? Absolutely. Character designs feel true to their comic counterparts, and they specifically nailed the look of both Spider-Man and Venom. Spider-Man has the tone muscle definitions we come to expect from a superhero, but we can also see the way his tight spandex wraps around his ribs, reminding us that he is still very much a scrawny teenager too. Venom, on the other hand, is far darker, though not literally. The Venom symbiote is purple and black, akin to how it appeared in the comics. In the Ultimate run, the costume was black with purple highlights, but here it's closer to purple with black highlights, leading to much discourse surrounding how it looks. And it lends itself more to being a goopy parasite that is better accomplished by adding purple than the Venom movies did by adding these weird jizz lines over the suit. Either way, this more alien-like color adds to the way Venom is presented in this game. Less as an independent individual like we've seen in the Venom movies, and more as a parasitic demon. He has the ability to completely overtake his host like a werewolf in the night, nearly corrupting Peter and ravaging the mind of Eddie in just a moment's time. His stature is large, teeth sharp, and his jagged eyes give this iteration of the character everything he needs to be distinct, and in some shots, shots terrifying when he isn't T-posing in the background. I have to mention that some of the visual errors here are not due to a shoddy PC port, but are due to the particular vendor that I purchased the game from, packaging the game with a pre-installed widescreen mod that, while in gameplay works well with minimal sacrifices, does make certain cutscenes look off. Fortunately, it doesn't stop this interpretation of Venom from being one of the most beast-like we've seen in the series to date. One could argue that Web of Shadows had a meaner Venom, but that interpretation borders on Lovecraftian horror. Where the two games parallel, at least, is in stature. Eddie in Ultimate absolutely towers over Peter, and in fact, most characters do. Ultimate Peter is a scrawny 15-year-old and certainly looks apart. Villains like Rhino look like they take shits bigger than Peter, and characters like the Goblin and Venom pressure through both stature and abilities, which I'll get into later. For now, since we've already brought up Web of Shadows and Spider-Man 2, you're probably thinking about the voice acting, which at least for Peter in both games were interesting. Everyone remembers the voice of Peter in Web of Shadows being like nails on a chalkboard. Where's Cage at his search party? But it should also be noted that Tobey Maguire wasn't the greatest voice actor either, gracing us with some of the most limp dick delivery I've ever heard in a video game.
This is the part where you fall down.
Regardless, I feel that Peter in this game is portrayed near perfectly, as Sean Marquette delivers a voice that encapsulates a teenager that just wants to be taken seriously. Something I've always appreciated about the Ultimate Spider-Man run is that Peter has a temper. Peter Parker is always trying to live up to the lofty moral ambitions of Spider-Man, and sometimes he fails.
I need to quit getting almost killed by stupid people is what I need.
He is a 15-year-old after all, and his dialogue is written accordingly.
Don't make me hurt you, Eddie. I'm totally serious.
Other characters provide great performances, with Eddie being another standout. He really sounds like someone in a constant fever dream, being taken again and again by the symbiote, fighting for control but not wanting to give it up. Eddie is the feeble host, while Venom is the bellowing devil over his shoulder. By the end of the game, when chasing Trask, a kill both Eddie and the suit want, their demonic scream that sounds like Eddie and the suit in sync will send chills down your spine. I can praise the voices here all day, but if we're talking about quality, then I must introduce you to arguably the best soundtrack in any Spider-Man game, full of high-octane bangers and relaxed beats for swinging through the city. It perfectly fits the bombastic nature of the game, and it's in my personal top 10 soundtracks of all time. My only gripe regarding the look of the game is the camera, because you will be fighting this thing throughout the playthrough. Yes, I felt like I was winning that fight, but it shouldn't be a fight in the first place. I haven't mentioned cameras much when talking about the other Spider-Man games, and I've gotten some comments about why I haven't, and the reason is that in nearly every game I played from the 6th generation and prior, they struggled with cameras, and because these games are so old, I'd cut it some slack. I also don't know a ton about game design, but what I do know is that cameras are deceptively hard to get right, especially in tight spaces, so I don't want to harp on it too much. It's easy to see how this game's presentation succeeds in filling Spider-Man 2's shoes, while establishing its own identity, and I can do nothing less than applaud a drastic shift in direction after the smash success of the previous game. These days, a game like Ultimate Spider-Man would likely never go further than an elevator pitch. What's further impressive is that the gameplay here follows suit, the suit excluded. I think one of the biggest letdowns for this game when I first played it as a kid was how I saw in one of the idle trailers that I can no longer find online that Peter had a black suit with tendrils and all coming out of it, and yet the main game has no black suit to be found. Sure, we do get the suit as a 100% completion award, but this is a simple skin swap. Putting on my tinfoil hat for a moment, I'd say the suit in the trailer indicate a potential prologue where we might have played as Peter with the black suit, and essentially experienced what was later presented in the opening cutscene. Instead, we get a skin that will forever be a sign of what could have been. The other unlockable skins here remind me of just how spoiled we were by Insomniac's 50+ suits. The selection here is slim, but for the time perfectly acceptable, and I appreciated specifically the handful of Peter skins, allowing you to swing around in civilian clothes, which is otherwise rare in the story. You'll only swing civilian style near the end and in the opening, where the game shows you the webs, which wind up being solid when compared to Spider-Man 2. There's a notable lack of freedom here, but the physics feel heavier and thus more realistic. I also didn't realize how much it matters to you guys, but your webs do connect to buildings. I've seen people criticize Web of Shadows and The Amazing Spider-Man specifically for this, and while I've never been too bothered by it, if you do care, you'll be happy with it here. Every line you throw out is a proper pendulum, and within this swing you can both climb up the web and boost your swing, which alone offers room for expression and precision. Knowing when to boost, climb, both or neither will be key to success. And those same principles were true in Spider-Man 2, although Ultimate Spider-Man presents a simple means of allowing room for error by adding a second jump. Sure, it defies the laws of physics, but so do most things you do. A second jump in the air allows for more distance if you undershoot, and if performing precise platforming, it allows a minor correction in the air. This allows Ultimate Spider-Man to have greater air control compared to the more realistic Spider-Man 2 swinging. I'll try to stop making comparisons now because pitting Spider-Man 2 and Ultimate swinging against each other is a potential video in itself, but something I appreciated about Ultimate was the level of polish. Animations flow well from one another, and the many flips that Peter spins into ooze fluidity, and this carries to the wall crawling and eventually wall running. If approaching a wall with speed, you can hold circle to stop or tap circle to carry your momentum into a run, which if tapping X after sees you performing a side eject or back eject. Where the depth comes from here is that the side eject can maintain speed in a given direction and set you up for a tight turn around a corner. Additionally, if you accidentally swing into a wall, you can quickly tap circle to recover and make it seem like you totally didn't slam into a billboard there. Back ejects also offer insane utility, as you can approach a wall, run up to it, and if you tap X while vertically scaling, you'll spring off the wall and face the other direction. The utility of this is admittedly slim in practice. If you have point A and B, it's easy to see your goal and perform a swing that combines both climbing and boosting to achieve the trajectory, but it's within free roaming, where swinging is a free-form expression, that the utility is seen. Let's suppose you approach two buildings, one is higher than the other, and if you want to clear the shorter building, you could just swing over it, but you could also swing into the alleyway, run up the side of a higher building, and then launch off that wall, clearing the shorter building and setting yourself up perfectly for the next obstacle. It may not be as efficient, but holy shit does it look cool. Let's look at an alternative scenario where this ability is both stylish and useful. Let's say you're approaching a goal and need to make a turn, but you miss it. You can run up a wall and press the jump button as you are turning around, allowing you to back eject in the opposite direction, letting you course correct with both finesse and efficiency. Because that's an important balance to strike for me. If I'm doing traversal or really completing any task in a game, I want to execute it to the best of my ability while looking as cool as possible. I'm not here to argue if that's the right way to play, but that is the reality of how I enjoy video games. An exception to this is when I play Spider-Man games, because Peter has frequently executed swinging that is more finesse than coherence, prioritizing looking cool over calculated efficiency, and this makes the swinging immersive. Peter in this game has enough tools to help him get around and even more to get around with style, and especially a Spider-Man that isn't even old enough to drive would surely take more pleasure in making a playground out of the city. So in Spider-Man games, Ultimate specifically, it is more immersive and therefore more enjoyable to make use of these stylish inefficiencies. The point is, being stylish and efficient at the same time is feasible in many ways, and I love the swinging for that. My only minor gripe with the system is that the web zipping is not as precise as I'd like. When exploring Queens, you'll frequently come across a challenge where the homes are often too short to swing from, or perhaps there's a roof that you aren't quite close enough to clear. The web zip will solve that problem, as Peter can throw out a line and quickly pull himself in the direction of his web. The challenge I found is that your web zip can reach something directly in front of you or 50 feet down the road. And when coasting above rooftops where any given distance from you and your objective is a collage of roofs overlapping each other, how can you web zip onto exactly what you want? The answer in my playtime is hope for the best. If pointing in a particular direction, you can influence roughly where your web zip goes, but it's never exact. If an inaccurate air web zip is performed, then you'll be less blasting forward and more slamming the brakes. Alternatively, you'll shoot straight up, which is equally not helpful in most situations. The problem I have with this criticism is that with enough precision, you can always go where you want, but that is extremely difficult on a controller, and there's no indicator of where you're aiming your web zip before it's fired. I also struggle to hold this against the game because I think it's just a reasonable limitation of the game and its systems. Regardless, you eventually develop the game sense necessary to recognize when to take the gamble on the web zips and when not to, and this skill will be crucial when engaging in the races across New York. Ultimate Spider-Man has a tutorial for swinging, but the races are a tutorial for movement. Early in the story, you'll come across Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four, who will challenge you to a race occasionally. And a quick aside, the dialogue between these two is just perfect. It's teenage trash talk at its finest.
Moon Knight is faster than you.
Anywho, these races will unlock a series of time trials and up to 4 levels of swing speed upgrades. What I appreciate about these races, separated into tiers of easy, medium, hard, and insane, is that they, through what they ask of you alone, teach you new ways to use and refine your skills. Initial races will test very basic platforming and swinging skills. You'll learn when to double jump, how long to hold down the X button to influence the height of said jumps, and how to swing proficiently. You can unlock the next set of races by beating all the races in the previous difficulty or achieving gold medals on a handful. This is a great system because it allows experienced players to quickly move on to the harder challenges, but they have to prove themselves by achieving the gold medal, which doesn't come too easy. Hell, even the ultimate medals on these early challenges are plenty difficult on some of them. The medium races will begin introducing some checkpoints that require specific conditions like standing in place or sticking to a wall. Achieving the gold on these, especially those with a wall checkpoint, will naturally introduce wall running and eventually jumping from a wall run, which once learned will be further tested within the hard races. Now it's not about wall ejecting, but wall ejecting with intention. These races will seriously start to challenge you, and this is most true for the insane races. These require pinpoint accuracy and near flawless performance to achieve the gold medal. There are some advanced techniques you'll pick up along the way, such as beginning a swing from a stationary position. When doing so, you'll get a jump in momentum greater than a web zip or a swing beginning from the air. This can then be cancelled into a double jump or a web zip, offering a strong start to any traversal. After each set of time trials, you'll face off against Johnny in increasingly harder one-on-one races. And these are mildly challenging, but after you master all the races, you have a final trial against the Human Torch, and I need you to understand the odds are all already stacked against you. For one, Johnny can fly. If there's a high point you need to get to, he can fly in a straight line to it, while you have to make a greater effort. And the same goes when crossing things like the bridge connecting the two islands. Johnny also knows the route, which you don't, at least the first time, and he'll know the most efficient way to the next checkpoint. It's with this knowledge that you'll understand how when I was playing this game as a kid, I was fucking slaughtered over and over again. I genuinely had not done anything more difficult in my younger years. It took days. I remember I would spend hours cracking away at this thing, taking a break for a few days and then coming back to do it all over again. When I finally beat it, I was on top of the world, and no matter how many times I replayed the game over the years, I never even attempted that race again. But this time, I had a fucking score to settle. The final race sees Johnny at his fastest, and in a race around the entire island, requiring competency in every facet of movement. Look at any of the forum posts of the time and you'll see what I mean. God, some people believe that this was intentionally impossible. So here I am, 6 in the morning at the end of a bender of races and intoxicating determination. I initiated the race and I was locked in. Eye of the Tiger does not even begin to describe the sheer focus I maintained. The world outside my monitor disappeared, and all that remained in my peripheral were the memories of my previous attempt at this colossal challenge and my 10-year-old self watching in anticipation. I wasn't flawless, but I was damn near close. After moving as fast as the game could allow me and clenching my jaw enough to justify dentures, I finished by the skin of my shattered teeth. First fucking try. And man, it feels good. And before you guys come in saying, oh, actually, this game was super easy and anyone who struggled with it must be an idiot, I don't give a fuck, okay? This means a lot to me. Let me have this. Anyway, I hope I've illustrated that the web swinging here is really solid. The best? Probably not, but its competency is appreciated. Combat exists in a similar trajectory, opting to not parallel its predecessor. Gone are the counters and complex combos, and in are the more basic combos and web-based combat. You have up to 5 punches and kicks, with a mix of the two offering the best damage. In the air, you have a basic 2-hit combo, but it's webs that offer the greatest utility in combat. When an enemy goes down, you have to web them up, lest they regain their health and rise again. This leads to interesting combat scenarios, where you can choose to either methodically take down one enemy and web them at a time, or take down the whole group in a swift combo, waiting until the end to web them all. It's a simple choice, with either answer being viable, but these choices are complicated when new enemy types are introduced. You'll have the basic light and heavy enemies, but thrown into the mix are enemies that carry different weapons, sometimes flamethrowers, sometimes guns, but always extremely lethal. Your new challenge is figuring out who to take down first. Do you take out the most lethal enemies, often with the most health, or do you take down the weaker enemies because even if they can't do much damage on their own, they can stun you with a hit, leaving you open to follow-up attacks from other enemies? There is no right answer, but it keeps the combat consistently engaging. Enemies can also be temporarily webbed, allowing for a follow-up attack or throw, and they can even be hung from streetlights too. Your methods for countering are non-existent, with the best defense being a jump in the other direction. Most enemies can't hit you in the air, and because jump attacks do solid damage with minimal risk, as you can just jump back into the air, rinse and repeat, the problem I see is that it prevents the player from engaging more with the combat, which they should, because even if it isn't much, there is some depth to be found here. One technique is to push the stick against the wall while fighting an enemy, which will cause Spider-Man to bounce off said wall towards the enemy, doing extra damage. There's also the ability to web in the air, which allows you to tie someone down without suffering the consequences of being locked in place on the ground. You really get to test these skills in the combat tours, which see you moving through areas defeating different classes of thugs, and genuinely, these are challenging, especially when guns are involved, as they just shred your health bar. But what's interesting about the combat with Spider-Man is that these difficult enemies are near exclusive to the combat tours, not showing up at all in the main story, which could have done the game some favors variety-wise. The combat is not great, but good enough to carry the game. It's literally 3 hours though, you could get away with zero combat. The combat tours and races are a great means of learning new skills, but the unfortunate reality is that they are required to an albeit minimal extent to progress in the story. This is a kind of padding seen previously in Spider-Man 2, and while it was worse there, I still don't enjoy its inclusion here. It took me roughly 2 hours and 50 minutes to finish the game, and about 30 minutes were spent completing these city goals, as the game calls it. That's less than a fifth of the game, but with a story as varied as this, I just wanted to get to the next chapter. All this said, I struggle to call this content filler. There are genuine reasons to engage with the city goals. The races increase swing speed and teach you how to swing with more skill. The combat tours increase your health, and both the tokens and city events contribute to unlocking costumes. Finally, completing city events is peak Spider-Man. If you're playing like a true Spider-Man, you'll be stopping along the way to your goal to help an injured person, stop a mugging, stop a car, and you can even encounter hostage situations and shocker out in the overworld. It's varied enough, and if you really don't like being interrupted, then you can complete all the requirements right away, as the goals are cumulative, though that only applies to repeat playthroughs. If you're a fan of this game, then you know there's a really large large, goopy portion of the gameplay I have yet to speak of, Venom. Ultimate Spider-Man has plenty of things to separate itself from the character's other entries, but this, the ability to play as Venom, is the defining aspect of the game. Venom appears in a handful of missions and a few boss fights too. A minor praise I want to give off the bat is that Venom in boss fights functions the exact same in gameplay. His moveset is the same, abilities the same, and health bar is the same too. One of Venom's central mechanics is the decay of Eddie's health, which can only be satiated by consuming the life force of civilians. In boss fights, Eddie will slowly lose health, and if he consumes you, he will get some back. Details like this elevate the boss fights because we are completely prepared for the boss, as we've gotten to know their moveset personally. Venom's gameplay is less developed than Peter's, but I can understand why. Venom's moveset is relatively new, designed from the ground up, but Peter's moveset was refined by Spider-Man 2, and Activision already had the foundation for the character. Regardless, Venom is a ton of fun to move around with. He has basic hops, but also larger leaps that can clear buildings and scale skyscrapers. He can climb walls, jump along those walls, and has a tendril whip that functions the same as a web zip, though less effectively because of how heavy he is. There is room for these moves to be combined, such as wall jumping to horizontally launch yourself off the wall, making clearing the larger gaps between skyscrapers easier to manage. Moving as Venom overall is a pure joy, start to finish. He leaves claw marks in walls, jumps so high it feels like the camera is barely keeping up with him, and every step makes said camera shake with impact. Where Peter would take fall damage, Venom leaves a small crater. It's visceral. Where Venom is at his most unique is in combat. He has devastating up-close attacks, but also ranged tendril strikes that take care of both groups and ranged opponents. He has a basic slash in the air, and he can grab opponents and throw them, or in some cases, break their back. Venom can also grab cars and throw them at his enemies or any unlucky civilians. It's simple, but it's a ton of fun, and it doesn't need to be deeper because with the game's short length, the Venom gameplay coasts by off the novelty alone. Once the game is finished, you can choose to swap between Eddie and Peter at any time, and Venom, even through events we will discuss soon, dons a white spider across his torso. When free roaming as Venom, you can engage in a few races that function similarly to Peter's, but with less variety and less required skill. They are a fun distraction though, and an enjoyable enough endgame challenge. But obviously, if you're given the opportunity to play as Venom, your first thought would not be of movement or combat, it would be of terrorizing the population. Where Spider-Man in this game spends his time saving the people of New York, in previous entries saving way too many balloons, as Venom you get to do the opposite. In fact, the game revels in indulging the player as the first victim you consume is a small child with a Spider-Man balloon, and it is pure catharsis. If you try to rampage in the endgame, then you will enter a minigame where every piece of property destroyed and person killed results in some score, and an ever-increasing wanted level. At first, it's Sable's goons, helicopters, trucks, but at its highest point, you'll see the SHIELD helicarrier comes down to deal with you, and I am not kidding when I say surviving this stage is genuinely difficult, because the SHIELD agents have a ton of health, can fly, and there's the aforementioned helicopters and Sable agents to deal with too. There's certainly a stark disparity between this and Peter's endgame. Everything about Peter is contrasted by Eddie. Movement is more leaps and bounds and swings and zips. Combat is more crowd control over individual target webbing. And stature-wise, it's like looking at 5'11" and 6 feet side by side. Fortunately, while the Peter side of gameplay benefits greatly from mechanical depth, both are elevated by the entertaining set pieces, and nowhere is this better felt than in the boss fights. Something many games struggle to realize is the impact of superhero fights. Yes, we can feel the villain's power by having them do a lot of damage, but instead, Ultimate Spider-Man demonstrates the power of characters by having them actually throw you across the map. We can look at the first of many boss fights with Venom against none other than Wolverine, who can both throw you and be thrown. The fact that this little runt can haul Venom across an entire bar is so awesome. And further, the fact that we can do it back turns what otherwise would be a basic one-on-one encounter to a lofty clash of the titans. These fights can be dynamic too, as the Wolverine fight even ends within a new setting. Venom's boss fights usually have an interesting mechanic where the boss can do insane damage to you, but you can tap out and consume a human to heal. If too much damage is taken, then your healing will be stunted, meaning that there's always an element of risk to these decisions. It also means that fights without ample civilians nearby put you on a time limit, as your health slowly decays. The quality of the boss fights is present across the game, but unfortunately, it seems Venom's missions tend to fare better. The first encounter is an exception. The game starts strong as you are tutorialized to the combat while fighting Venom in the rain, transitioning to the street where we see an exposed power line. If we can bait Venom into stepping into it, he'll take a significant amount of damage, rewarding clever players and those who remembered the cutscene that ends the fight. This is followed up by the Rhino. The fight begins strong, seeing you following the trail of destruction left in the Rhino's way, before eventually confronting him in a car dealership that conveniently has cars all over it. Rhino will charge all over the lot and send plenty of cars your way, and your goal is to dodge by jumping around, and when he does a specific attack that leaves him vulnerable, you jump in, or rather on, and get your damage in. I don't mean to break down the fight this much, but it's important because you realize that many of the fights follow this pattern. The next fight is another encounter with Venom, and it follows the same design. Venom will do a basic combo, roar, and then practically wait for you to attack him. In fairness, this has changed slightly in his third fight where it's a roar, combo, then vulnerability, but the point remains. It's a pattern that once recognized, which does not take long, bores the fight. Another example is the Green Goblin fight. The fight sees him jumping at you, throwing a fireball, and then making a specific noise followed up by 2 fireballs, and then he's vulnerable. The second phase is the same idea. He jumps at you 3 times, and the final time doing an extra area of effect damage, burning out, and becoming vulnerable. In fairness to the fight, the challenge comes from those fireballs I mentioned. When designing enemy projectiles, you need to strike a good balance between a projectile that tracks you enough to be threatening, but not so much that it feels unfair, and the Goblin achieves this. But if we're talking boss fights, I can't not mention this game's most iconic scene, Venom versus Electro at Times Square. There's a lot going on in this fight. Not only is Electro doing a significant amount of damage and stunning you with electricity, but if you run away to heal, then Electro will start hurting Peter, so we effectively have 2 health bars to keep track of. The most unique element of this fight comes in its second phase. Electro, after having his health bar depleted, will rise to one of the billboards around Times Square and absorb the electricity from them, turning into pure energy capable of teleporting and hitting a lot harder. He will continue doing this throughout the fight unless you mid-fight take out the neon signs before he can use them. On repeat playthroughs, this loses its luster, but on the first time through, it's a well-done implementation. Venom continues having good boss fights as he faces off against Sable, who is arguably the toughest boss in the game for both Peter and Eddie. We get familiar with the different parts of her moveset, as with Eddie she focuses on range more, due to Eddie overpowering her, but with Peter, she engages in close combat because as seen on screen, she outclasses him. What further stunts you is that Peter is without his webs during this fight, which makes the reinforcements more trouble, but the fight is strong and ends with the bridge being destroyed, and with Sable opting to team up with Peter to temporarily save the civilians from the now out-of-hand situation. Most boss fights contain elements of these prologues and epilogues, such as when tracking down Rhino, Goblin, and Beetle. You'll have to keep up with the villain and save civilians that they endanger along the way. In Beetle's case, I actually had hoped for the chase to be longer. Beetle not only moves at a challenging speed, bobbing and weaving through alleys, but he even blows a hole in the side of a building, forcing us to enter said building and save a civilian. Further down, we see Beetle creating barriers between the buildings that force our swinging to be more precise. And the biggest problem with this is that there just wasn't more of it. Okay, that's a pretty bad criticism, but the real issue is the boss fight, which sees you just chasing Beetle around doing a very short air combo over and over again at a construction site. What might be weaker than this boss fight is the fight against Spider-Man, because it surprisingly doesn't happen. I understand, a fight like that couldn't happen because Venom would have to win, but he technically can, as he wins the spectacular fight against Carnage. Carnage has tendrils of his own, can heal on his own, and is fully capable of battering Venom. The fight is fun, it's a novelty for sure, but it's memorable, as is the final fight. It's the top of the Trask Tower, the rain pours down and fire is closing in on the grounded helicopter, but so is Venom. Peter needs to defeat a new, in-control Venom that is attempting to push Trask's helicopter off the building. You can prevent the helicopter from falling by attacking Eddie, but he will hit like a truck. The music during this fight is enough to carry it alone, and while it is now the 4th time we have fought Venom with the same moveset, it's appropriate, and the ending takedown is so good. I understand that I focus a lot on the bosses here, but if you've played the game, then you know it's a large majority of what you do. This game is a Spider-Man simulator as much as it is a boss gauntlet, and there are roughly 14 boss fights across the game, with only 19 missions. The gameplay is this game's bread and butter, all the way from the swinging and the ragdoll-inducing fights to the villainous rampages. And it makes sense because this game's story isn't bad, but it's not great either. It's just kinda here. In some ways, the story can seem a bit aimless. Peter and Eddie simply go through their own list of villains, occasionally crossing paths until the finale, but where I find myself appreciating the story more was viewing each chapter as its own issue of a series, or as episodes of a TV show. You'll have chapters that are mostly contained, but near the end you'll have a hint of what's to come next, or further something happening later on. Our story gives some background on the Black Suit, explaining that Peter and Eddie's parents were working together on a cure for cancer, but both died in a suspicious plane crash. What was left over, their inheritance, was the suit, which after bonding with Peter, eventually bonded to Eddie. Eddie found out what Peter had done and what his identity was, and became pretty mad about it. After an encounter with Rhino, we get an idea that there is still some symbiote left inside Peter, as he begins to have headaches whenever near Eddie, which eventually plays into a tedious boss fight. I get the idea, but I seriously dislike how a random headache causes me to lose a chunk of health, but I digress. Silver Sable shows up after this encounter, as they've been hired by Trask to capture the suit, taking the problem off of Peter's hands for a while. Once Venom escapes and shows up in Times Square, S.H.I.E.L.D. gets involved, which begins to annoy Peter more and more. Trask and associates figure out that Venom and Peter are somehow linked, meaning that if you can get one, the other will eventually show up. Sable kidnaps Peter but is eventually ambushed by Venom. Peter and Eddie take each other down, leaving Sable to clean up the pieces. The two wake up in the Trask building, but Peter is faring far worse than Eddie. While being studied, it seemed like Peter was injected with a different kind of suit, leading him to take on the form of Carnage before Venom defeated him and consumed that part of the symbiote. Now, with an all-time high power level and a Trask stuck on a helipad, Peter has to take down Eddie once again, and upon doing so, S.H.I.E.L.D. shows up to pick up the pieces, though Eddie notably gets away. Nick Fury presents Peter with a document detailing the plane crash that killed his parents, with many witnesses claiming they saw the same thing, the suit. It seemed Eddie's father had tried the suit on board, and we cut to Eddie himself in a prison off the coast, where after realizing Trask didn't get the justice he deserved, the suit comes on, and Trask is dead. The game ends with Peter and MJ sitting atop a warehouse, processing what they just discovered, and understanding that even if the fight is over for now, Eddie is still out there. The story overall is just fine. It's not good, it's not bad, but it does what it sets out to do, which is seemingly provide a thin excuse for the many boss fights in the game. I mean, characters like Rhino and Beetle are almost entirely disconnected from the plot, and that isn't necessarily a problem. It makes some sense for a villain to just pop up, and as far as presenting an excuse for Spider-Man to jump in, well, you don't really need one. The whole great responsibility thing solves any motivational issues, and any side tangents are not only fun enough, but short enough to not create much of a problem. With that said though, the story's biggest weakness is again its short length, and that it doesn't say very much. It's a difficult thing to pin down. Does the story not say much because it's so short, or is the story short because it doesn't have much to say? Is this even an issue at all? I prefer quality over quantity, but I also can't say I wouldn't go fucking feral if there were an extra 5 missions here. More movement-centric missions would have been great, akin to what we saw in the Beetle chase. Hell, the fact we didn't get an appearance from Black Cat is a shocker in this game, especially given how much we would see of her later. Regardless of any issues within the actual plot, the writing here is honestly pretty good. It's cheesy and mildly annoying, but in a very endearing way. Characters are portrayed well. I mean, I love the dynamic between Eddie and the suit, the short-fused and attitude-heavy Peter, and the way that Sable, while ruthless and unrelenting, does not want to endanger lives unnecessarily. These characteristics, while again surface level because of the game's length, are enjoyable for their short time here. Some might argue that the context of the game might change your opinion on it, but I'm not so sure. I played the game as a kid and didn't know about the comic run and was super confused. I was like, why is the Hulk in this game? Because my only exposure to the Goblin was in the Sam Raimi movie. But now that I've read a handful of issues, and now that I have full transparency watched a lot of the comic run through Comic Historian, even with the context of who these people are and what their motivations are, the story doesn't really do much for me. Ultimately, the dialogue and individual moments carry the plot and continue to make it an enjoyable romp. So, looking back, Ultimate Spider-Man stands tall among the other Spider-Man games. Its art style is evergreen and its gameplay is smooth for the time, and certainly doesn't give the same whiplash a game like the first Spider-Man movie game does. Its ideas like a fully playable Venom and a story that has you switching between both him and Peter is done well for their first attempt, and it's a damn shame that the sequel for this game never made it far, because given how much Activision and Treyarch were able to polish the foundations of Spider-Man 2 while maintaining a sense of originality and identity, they could have created a true masterpiece the second time around. It's sad that this elusive second game would have seen you playing as both Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, which would have been insane. Fortunately, this isn't all there is to the game. It was also released for both the Game Boy Advance and the DS, both games being side-scrollers that were excellent in their own right despite the stories being the same. Ultimate Spider-Man will forever stand out because of its originality and style, and while future games might look better, play better, and being real here, might be better in just about every way, there is still merit to playing a game like this and lessons to be learned. So what can Insomniac learn from a game like this? Well, the most obvious lesson is that including Venom in any playable context is always a win, and that a unique idea with some flaws can be just as good as a polished idea that we have seen before. Seeing the web wings and increased speed in Spider-Man 2 has me excited to get a game that has a real chance of being the perfect marriage between fluid style and precise control. Insomniac has a lot to live up to, and our last Spider-Man 2 was hailed as the best for over a decade. So if they succeed and create the next best Spider-Man game, I'd be excited, and then anxious. Because I know the last time we got a Spider-Man 3, it was not very good. Or was it? Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video, I appreciate it. If you liked it, you can leave a like, you can subscribe for more, you can support me on Patreon if you want to get access to these videos early, and you can follow me on Twitter for any further updates. I really appreciate the support you guys have shown on the channel over the last little bit. I apologize for the inconsistent uploads, I've been in the middle of a move, but hopefully we'll get some more consistency soon. Thank you so much, I love you all, thank you to our patrons, whose names are on screen now, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.